All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm Sonia Carley. I am the faculty director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and we are delighted to welcome you to this event. We are especially delighted to welcome our guest today, David Spence. I see that several of you have a book in your hand, the book of Climate of Contempt, which is a book that David recently released and he will discuss with us today. And in short, it is about some of the impending challenges of our energy transition and some strategies and thoughts on moving forward in order to bridge or reconcile some of these divides. Before we get started, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on David, who I consider a friend, a colleague, and somebody who has courageously led in the field of energy policy for a very long time. David Spence is a Rex G. Baker Chair in Natural Resources Law at UT Austin's Law School, where he specializes in energy law, administrative law, environmental law, and oil and gas issues. In addition to teaching at the law school, David is also a professor of business, government, and society at UT Austin's McCombs School of Business. He teaches courses in energy and environmental regulation and is a co-author of a leading casebook, Energy, Economics, and the Environment. David will speak for about 40 to 50 minutes today, and then we will sit down together and have an open discussion and take questions from you. So think about those questions as you listen to David today and be prepared to ask them. I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to David. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that very kind introduction, Sonia. And thanks to the Kleinman Center for having me and for the University of Pennsylvania. And congratulations to the Kleinman Center on landing both Sonia Carley and Shelley Welton, two real leaders in this field nationally. This is great news for students here and for people in other departments, because you'll be able to collaborate with these terrific scholars for a long time. So I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this book today. And I'm happy that you all could come out and hear about it. I promised to keep closer to 40 minutes than 50 minutes, because I don't want to hear myself talk for that long. And I'm going to keep this up so I have I keep track of the time a little bit. I have one, where am I pointing this? My slide, people, can you advance it one? Yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk from one slide. I have other slides with figures from the book and things that we can reference if necessary when we have a question and answer period. But I want to just sort of describe for you what I think the basic contributions of the book are. And I'll start with why I wrote it. I've been teaching in this field of sort of the intersection of energy and the environment for a long time. And about a decade ago, I started to get the sense that it was more difficult for students to develop a complete, sophisticated understanding of complex regulatory issues like climate policy and climate politics. And I had some hunches as to why that was, but I started to do some research on the culprit that I was thinking about, and it was the changes in the modern information environment and the way in which people gather information and process it to form beliefs today compared to the way they did it back when we used to be able to regulate at the national level. And so the book is really about that and how those forces amplify very old, longstanding challenges to understanding that come from our sort of cognitive biases that many of you heard about, and the efforts of politicians and lobbyists to sway our views. And so I'll talk more about that, but the very first words in the book are this quotation you see in the upper right-hand side of this slide from Bertrand Russell. Never let yourself be diverted by what you wish to believe or what you think would have socially beneficial effects if it were believed. This is just philosopher speak for don't fall prey to motivated reasoning. And this is sort of the phenomenon that we're talking about, or that I'm talking about in this book. I think that this modern information system is distorting our understanding of a lot of things, almost everything associated with the energy transition, starting with climate science itself, but other aspects of the politics as well. And so let me unpack the way the book tackles this issue in a little bit more detail. So the first part of the book, part one, which is chapters 1 through 3, is intended to lay out both the history of the creation and evolution of the what I call the energy regulatory state, which is the set of statutory regimes that created the regulation that we have now today, that the energy industry must follow. And that story is one that I wanted to retell, in part because you need to understand those statutes and those regimes in order to really dive into the energy transition, what we call the energy transition in our field, which I think everybody in this room knows means transitioning to a lower carbon energy system, ideally one that is a net zero carbon emission system. And that involves a lot of difficult trade-offs and complex issues. And so in order to really understand that as a political challenge, it's important to understand what the existing regulatory system requires and says. And so I wanted to lay out the particulars of that system, but I also wanted to explain those statutes and their evolution. I wanted to explain the politics of their creation and the politics of their evolution in a way that I think is broader and doesn't omit things that I see omitted from the popular discussion of energy regulatory politics. And by that, I mean most of the popular discussion focuses on top-down rigging of the system, right? So both sides of the political debate believe that the system is rigged, or at least people on the outer poles do. They just disagree about who's doing the rigging and for what reason. And I think that cynicism and that sense of a fixed system has become pervasive, particularly on social media and in the popular debate that happens there about climate change. And certainly there are people who try to rig the system. And certainly they sometimes have influence over the system. But the social science empirical work, and particularly the work from political science, indicates that it's much more complicated than that they do not control the system as often as that popular debate seems to assume that they do. And that sometimes, or that often, when a lot of money comes in on one side of an issue, a lot of money comes in on the other side as well. And so the history through chapters of the development of this system in chapters 1 through 3 is really a way of telling that story with all of its messy complexity. So just to give you an example, it's commonly said in online and in conferences that I go to on regulation and regulatory policy and regulatory history, that the railroads wrote the Interstate Commerce Act, the first major national regulatory statute in the late 19th century. That's not true. There were really powerful railroads on both sides of that statutory fight. The Vanderbilts and Jay Gould opposed the Interstate Commerce Act. Some of the other railroads that were facing more competition than the Vanderbilt and the Gould railroads, favored its passage. And the same is true of most of the regulatory statutes. There was always a cynical explanation of them, but there are also other more complicated forces at work. Some people liked them, some people didn't. Samuel Insull, the creator of the first electric utility, is often credited with sort of creating the Federal Power Act in order to secure his monopoly. Again, that's a much more complicated story if you go back and look at the history of its creation. So this history in part 1 was designed to add some of that complexity to our understanding of what we have now. And it takes the story all the way up to now. It explains the creation of statutes, of major regulatory statutes, as what I call, or what others have called, and I borrow the term, Republican moments, small r Republican, meaning that these were typically situations where there was some sort of change in the market, a new energy technology, or some other disruptive change that caused problems for large segments of society, either massive economic inequality, or some people had the new form of energy like electricity and some didn't. And this created a groundswell of support for action or members of Congress, elected politicians saw that they could gain the support of voters if they took action. And so those Republican moments, that sort of bottom-up process is typically the way these major statutes were created. Now, according to political science literature, Republican moments happen when two things are present. Number one is that demand for action from the bottom up. Number two is a receptive environment in Congress, a receptive partisan environment in Congress. And so all the statutes I talk about in part one were created when that receptive partisan environment met the demand for public action. Sometimes the environment in Congress is receptive because one party completely dominates the chambers, both chambers of Congress and the presidency, as was the case in the New Deal, when Democrats had overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate. It was something like 82-12 in the Senate, and often for most of the New Deal, they had a margin of more than 200 seats in the House. That is 200 more seats than Republicans had. And so it was easy for Democrats to do what they wanted, to pass a whole bunch of regulatory statutes then. But in a lot of the other periods in which these Republican moments happened, there was bipartisan support, at least some of it, enough of it to get the regulatory statutes through Congress. So if you're my age, and some people in the audience might be my age, just a guess. You may remember the environmental era of the 1970s, when a lot of these major environmental laws that we have today were created by a Democratic Congress and often signed into law by Republican presidents. And they often had significant amounts of Republican support in Congress as well. And these bipartisan Republican moments tended to come when there was a new issue that both parties wanted to champion in order to improve their electoral futures, right? So that was the case in the 70s. That was the case during the progressive movement in the early part of the 20th century, when both parties had people that wanted to capture that issue for their party and be the ones that won those voters, henceforth. And so we have these sorts of situations at work when major regulatory statutes are created. The statutes that we still have today, the durable ones, tended to be created. I should stop. They didn't just tend to be created, they were created, every single one that I talk about in the book, with more than 75% support in both houses of Congress, often unanimous support. When Ronald Reagan vetoed Clean Water Act amendments in 1987, maybe, if I have that, if my memory is right, that veto was overridden by massive margins in the Senate. So you need those two things together. And so if Republican moments are how we overcome the sort of inertia that's built into our system and the various parties who are benefiting from the status quo and therefore lobbying to keep it, why can't we create a Republican moment today for climate change? Why has it been harder to do that than it was, say, in 1990 for acid rain? When a lot of the same things were happening. We had industry lobbying against the science, trying to cast doubt on the science. But we eventually got those amendments. Why can't we get that to happen today? And so Chapter 3 of the book brings us up to today and talks about the 21st century efforts to, I do that all the time at my age. I still think I'm in the 20th century. But anyway, the 21st century efforts to enact statutes that regulate greenhouse gas emissions at the national level. And as most of you probably know, we've come close twice. In 2009 and in 2021, the House of Representatives passed statutes that would have imposed limits on greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and both of those efforts failed in the Senate. And the stories of how they failed were kind of similar. In both cases, it was a coal state Democrats in the Senate that sort of sunk the bills. But there's something else at work here. I think the reason Republican moments are harder today than they were back in 1990 is because voters have changed and the set of voters to which members of Congress respond have also changed. And what do I mean by that? So starting in the 1980s, the parties, both in Congress and among the voters, started to diverge ideologically. The Republican Party took a turn to the right, ideologically became more conservative as political scientists measure that. And about 2 decades later, the Democratic Party started to move to the left. So their respective agendas got farther apart, and members of each party became more alarmed by the other party's agenda, making it harder to work together and cobble together majorities in Congress. That's one thing, the ideological polarization of parties. The other change in voters was the rise more recently of negative partisanship, or affective negative partisanship, to use the political science term, which is really the idea that partisan attachment, it becomes less about particular issues and more about an affirmation of one's cultural identity. I belong to this party because that's who I am. And it's increasingly negative because we're measuring partisan animosity, and it has gotten much more intense in the last 10, 15, 20 years. The degree to which each party hates the other has become worrisome. And I'm going to violate my promise to stick with one slide, and I'm going to show you some data on this. So here's data from the National Election Study on the right and from Pew Research on the left. The Pew data is an open-ended question about how you would describe members of the other party. And we see, it only goes back to 2016, but we see increases in negative descriptors, to say the least, and more worryingly, solid majorities of people in both parties using these descriptors, except for the word lazy, and I don't know why that is. Maybe because I'm on the left and I favor the energy transition. Maybe I don't understand why the Republicans think Democrats are lazy, but even more worrying to me is the National Election Study data, which goes back to 1978. Many of you, especially those of you that are involved in political studies, might know this data. It's called a feeling thermometer that the NES administers every national election, so every 2 years, and they ask people how they feel about all kinds of things, including members of the other party. And if 100 means I couldn't love them more, 0 means I couldn't hate them more. And back up until around the turn of the century, each party felt mildly negative about the other. And that is no longer true. They are much more intensely negative, at least they're willing to profess much more intensely negative feelings toward the other party. And alarming percentages of people in the most recent study were willing to assign a score of 0 to the other party. And that's a problem. That's what negative partisanship is. And that makes it even harder for members of Congress to reach across the aisle and build majorities for strong climate policy. So those are the 2 ways voters have changed. The third thing I talked about was how members of Congress respond to different voters. Back in the 70s, I don't have data from the 70s here, but back in the 70s, there were a lot more competitive districts in Congress. And when you're worried about re-election as a member of Congress, you had to worry about the average voter in your district and pleasing that voter. These maps, the color intensity reflects how solidly safe the district is for one party or the other. A safe district is one where there's overwhelming numerical support in the electorate for one party or membership of one party, so that the nominee from that party faces virtually no risk of losing the general election. So the way representatives of safe seats protect their re-election is to respond to the voters who vote in primaries, not the average voter in the general election. And so these data come, by the way, from Cook Political Report, but I could only find a map back to the 90s, but you can see how much it's changed even in the intervening years since 1997, how much more safe, intensely safe so many districts have become. And so if members of Congress are trying to please voters who are the ones who vote in primaries, the ones who are particularly ideologically polarized or extreme and particularly negatively partisan, their behavior is going to reflect that goal. And so some of the rhetoric and behavior we see in Congress can be explained as, pleasing that part of their constituency in order to protect their reelection. And it's this negative partisanship that I think has been exacerbated and fed and kept healthy by the modern media environment. So let me talk a little bit about the modern media environment, what I mean by that, and be a little more specific about the changes that have occurred and what I think they do to our perception of energy issues and of regulatory issues generally. So when I was the age of the students in this room, I got my news from one of three nightly newscasts. I wasn't like Lyndon Johnson. I didn't have 3 TVs, or Elvis. I think he had 3 TVs as well. But anyway, I got a nightly newscast, I got a daily newspaper, and our household got a monthly or weekly news magazine like Newsweek or Time. And I think we got a national paper as well, but that's it. That was my news. It was delivered or written almost entirely by trained journalists whose professional ethics required them to aspire, at least, to objectivity and completeness. And they were, of course, writing for an ideologically broad or heterogeneous audience, everybody in that town or everybody in the country. And that led to a certain way of writing the news and a certain way of consuming the news. I had plenty of time to read the paper, 24 hours before the next paper came and 24 hours before the next newscast. You could read everything. You could read to the last paragraph of a story where all the sort of qualifiers and caveats and complexity is found that sometimes contradicts the headline or the lead sentence. And you learn to sort of expect that kind of complexity. And then I would digest that information by talking about it face to face with people I knew, my family, my friends, my coworkers, neighbors, with all the context that face to face communication involves. I'm not just talking about facial cues and things like that. I'm talking about knowing the person you're talking to, right? If I'm talking to, crazy Uncle Joe, I know maybe I won't credit some of his declarative statements the way I would if I was talking to somebody who I know, a neighbor who's an expert in that topic, right? So, so forming beliefs, politically relevant beliefs about policy and other things was slower, and it was based on information that was sort of commonly consumed by everybody. And of course, the rise of cable news and ideological media and bots and social media has changed that in a big way. So now, while there are still plenty of trained journalists who are trying to put educating the readership first before persuading the readership, there's a lot of other stuff in which they're competing with, a lot of other sources in your daily information flow that are more interested in persuading you than educating you. And some of that's subtle, and it may be combined with education in a lot of advocacy journalism, but some of it's not subtle at all. Some of it is misleading, right? So bots and others will try to mislead you and steer you toward a particular point of view. And it is the combination of these things that make it harder to develop a full understanding of an issue and force us, or push us, I should say, to form and firm our political beliefs really quickly, too quickly, before we really get a chance to understand all of the complexity that's involved. And this is because social media, most people talk about these issues on social media now. And if you learn about something instantly, and you can talk to somebody instantly about it. And if you're talking to somebody instantly about it, chances are they're in your social media community, your bubble. These are bubbles, right? And you all understand this already, that the algorithms are going to give the people in your community a certain set of information that is different from what the algorithms give to other people. And when everybody's agreeing and based on the same sort of understanding of the issues, it's easy for us to sort of conclude that that must be what's true. And when someone comes into the bubble and poses a different, says the opposite of what we believe is true, often that message is not met with, oh, really, tell me more, but rather, it's hostility. And the norms of conversation online are, just not the same as they would be in person with somebody with whom you want to maintain a relationship. And so what we end up having sort of our beliefs formed prematurely, hardened quickly, and we sometimes are involved in social media communities that can demonize opponents and their views. And that's not a good thing. That's not how we learn about complexity. We learn about complex issues by having our beliefs challenged, audited. We want our beliefs to be audited by others. We want to talk to people in person ideally, but people who are representatives of, holders of contrary beliefs, because that's how we get a sense of, whether there are either holes in our argument or shortcomings or issues or complexities that we just didn't think of. Here in a university, we do that by design, right? You get in a classroom and the professor can ensure that you're seeing all of those different perspectives. But out in the world, it's harder to get that than it used to be. So it's that set of dynamics that I think is distorting perception. Here's my clip art. I'm not good with with visual aids, but my clip, that's what that's about. It's distorting our perception of everything, of almost everything associated with the energy transition. And the energy transition is about getting to net zero carbon emissions in our economy in let's say by mid-century, or if we can't make that, some reasonably timely period thereafter, which is a really complicated issue. A very, very complicated issue. And it involves trade-offs. It involves trying to deal or manage tensions between keeping us a reliable supply of energy, making it affordable, and particularly affordable to the most vulnerable members of society, and making it net zero, as clean as possible. And the way that those issues are discussed online, I argue, because of the dynamics I just described, are sometimes incomplete. They are, to quote one of the reporters who studies these issues, it's easy for reporters and others to want to sand the inconvenient edges off the facts in order to steer people toward a belief that they think would have beneficial social effects if it were believed. And that's just human nature. If we feel urgently about climate change or anything, we think people are not somehow missing something important, otherwise they would agree with us. It's sort of human nature to want to push them in that direction. And so when experts do this online, when people with lots of followers do this online, and particularly when they're derisive or nasty to people who raise other views, or they just assume that those people are sort of stooges of the utilities or the fossil fuel industry or whatever, when they denigrate them and encourage people not to engage their views, then we don't get that exposure to these opposing views. We learn how to respond with ad hominem dismissals instead of asking the kind of questions that might help you get a fuller sense of what those trade-offs involve. And so chapter 5 of the book, as you can see from the table of contents, is really about diving deeply into all of those trade-offs. And I don't really take a position on any of those issues to, what technology we should be pushing or not pushing, what policy instrument we should be using or not using. I used to have opinions about that, but as the time passes and we don't have major regulation of emissions, I sort of start to come to the conclusion that let's do something, right? And I'm sort of happy to talk about that during the Q&A, but that's what that chapter is about. It's designed to sort of educate students and others about, in a deep way, about what those trade-offs involve and how we can, move forward without giving any of them short shrift or hiding them from our students or online audiences, but rather by acknowledging them and talking about how we can move forward anyway. And then the last chapter of the book is really about how we can have more productive dialogue on these issues, generally speaking. And so this is not something, most of the rest of the book were things that fields that I was already working in, politics and law, social science. the last chapter on hope and conversation is about, is really the product of my research into experts on persuasion or being influential, how we talk to each other in a way that can influence others, especially if the subject matter is emotional. And most political issues now are emotional. And so what I found, a little bit to my surprise, was that people in the media and communication field, political psychology, voting behavior, philosophy, and history, and climate communication, they were all pushing sort of a common or heavily overlapping sets of advice about how to do this. And it was about, leaving behind the idea that the people who disagree with me must either be ignorant about some facts that they just don't understand or be motivated by ill will. Leaving behind what the communication scholars would call the information deficit theory of persuasion, and instead engaging with people in a much more open-ended, non-judgmental way, which is really about building trust, maintaining a relationship, and trying to be influential over the long run, over an iterated set of conversations over time, the kind of conversations you might have with a family member, a coworker, a neighbor, or a friend, on climate change in ways that are not intended to win the argument in any of those conversations, really. It's about asking questions. So I'll give you an example. There's a couple of political scientists named Brookman and Kalla who have done research on what they call deep canvassing. And this is sort of a typical example that I use in chapter 6, but it's about persuading voters to vote for the candidate in a canvassing situation that you're canvassing for. And it's about multiple meetings with the voter over time, all of which involve almost entirely questions. Why are you opposed to voter X or referendum issue X? Okay, get an answer. Well, if the premise of your opinion, if that wasn't true, would that change your mind? And then you don't rush to Google and show them that it's not true. You sort of let them sit with that for a while, and then you come back again later. Maybe they've looked it up, maybe they haven't. You might persuade them and you might not. And they might persuade you about something, right? So to be influential, you have to be willing to cede that control over the conversation and not expect to always prevail. And so the chapter provides, sort of a series of sections. Brookman and Kalla is just one of them, by people who really study these techniques and explain how they would put them into practice. Maybe some of you have heard of Catherine, why am I blanking on her last name? The climate scientist who does communication. Hey-ho, thank you so much. Senior moment. Her book on this is really suggesting a very similar approach. So my belief is that because this is a bottom-up problem involving voters more than anything else, then the solution needs to be a bottom-up solution involving voters. Yes, there are corporate entities who are trying to confuse people. And yes, there are rich people who are giving money to campaigns designed to stop the election of representatives who would support stronger climate policy. But almost every political decision that's been relevant in the history of this issue is also explainable by members of Congress trying to please those particularly extreme voters. And those particularly extreme voters won't change their mind by you telling them that they've been fooled by rich people or the corporate elites. They will change their mind only through sort of engagement. And so the way to do this is to talk to people that on a regular basis about this. Don't avoid politics. Don't avoid climate change because it's hard, and it might jeopardize your friendship. It won't jeopardize your friendship if you use these, or most of the time, if you use these techniques, because you're not judging them and you're not telling them they're wrong. You're asking about what they think. And so that's where the book ends. And the book comes to that conclusion really after introducing it in the introduction with a quote from Pete Buttigieg, and I'll finish with that because I'm at 40 minutes. I was at an event in Austin in 2022. I don't think this was ever written down anywhere, but I heard it and I knew that it was on YouTube and I went and transcribed it. Somebody asked Pete Buttigieg, how do we, break through this climate of contempt? And that wasn't what they used, the question, that's not how it was phrased, but that's what they were asking. How do we talk to people about these issues, our friends and family? And he said, well, even online, you talk to people the way you would talk to a family member who is a good person, generally would give you the shirt off their back, does kind things for people and so on. But when they open their mouth about politics, it horrifies you. You have to, or to quote Barack Obama more recently, you have to give them the same grace you would extend to other people, right? And so I believe that that's going to be, along with all the other things we try to do to make stronger climate policy a reality, I think that's going to be an essential part of how we change our politics to move in the proper direction going forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Oops. We're gonna get, okay.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, I might still use that, yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your book. Thank you for bringing your book to us. Thank you for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I'll kick us off again, as I noted, I'll kick us off with a few questions, and then I know that you all have many questions as well. I also, just as an aside, I just listened to the Ezra Klein Show podcast this week with Pete Buttigieg, and he talked about exactly that. So I will also pitch that as a complement to the conversation that we just had, which was quite lovely. I would like to start with a question. This might come off as a pushback, but my question is, are we giving industry and politicians too much credit by pushing so much of the blame, and blame might not be a great word, but pushing so much of the blame to voters and to the media? And I tend to think of the conversations around climate as having moved from a state of climate denialism to climate deception, led by industry and some policymakers or politicians. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just curious to get your reflections on that. And is it possible that we're not giving enough blame to these leaders as well?
Yeah, one of the things I say in the book is that everybody who writes something chooses what they write based on what they think is missing from the public debate. I talk a lot about the disinformation that comes from the right. There's more of it. The empirical research shows that there's more of it online floating around from the right, quite a bit more. And that a lot of these narratives are coming from particularly broadcast, right-wing broadcast outlets. Which is true, right? And so, so I don't mean to say that that's not happening or that it's completely inconsequential. What I believe is that we're missing this other part of it. We're getting wound up about Democrats or Republicans on the other side to the point where huge percentages are willing to give them a score of 0 in their feeling thermometer. Support for political violence, according to at least one poll, is on the uptick. And so what I want is for us to be able to become more sophisticated consumers of online information and of the online world generally, and to get a deeper understanding of how it's distorting our perception of things, which is not to say that there isn't lots of culpable behavior that involves Fox News and its supporters. Obviously, there's conscious disinformation coming from Fox News, as we know from the Dominion lawsuit. So, but the sort of psychological forces that are amplified by the internet are worth understanding, so that we don't become like that. And some of us are becoming like that, and I use examples in the book to show that.
Yeah. Well, maybe then we could go down a pretty dark hole for a second together. And that is with AI presence becoming ever more present, with misperceptions and possible deceptions and evidence of lying across all spectrums, as all of this is on the rise, does this mean that our opportunity, or our possibility rather, for addressing the imminent climate challenge is scary?
Well, yeah, it is scary, but I mean, I titled the last chapter Hope and Conversation. I don't think it's hopeless to sort of acknowledge these things and, tackle them head on. And I also think that students are acutely aware of this. I mean, certainly in other realms of life, people are pretty aware that the internet or social media is making them unhappy. And this is just the political dimension of all that. And so, yeah, AI will, there was a study the other day where something like 100 climate questions were posed to some chat bot, and 79 of the 100 answers contained important errors. And that's because they're using what's online, and those errors were based on disinformation that it found online, right? Yeah, it is scary, and there's a lot of disinformation. But as you go online, if you're going to be online to think about these things, hopefully you will develop the habits of not paying attention to anonymous accounts, of if something you read feels really good and the dopamine is going crazy, go double check it, right? Go ask, go look and see if it's actually right? So I'm hopeful that the internet is young, right? And people are still just getting used to it. And even if it's been there your entire life, you're going to have experiences where you encounter the truth that is different than what you believed was the truth. I used the example talking to Andy this morning about the guy that showed up at Comet Pizza with the AR-15, thinking he was going to bust up a child trafficking ring. And when he was arrested, said, I guess I had bad information. He was in a QAnon bubble. Well, a lot of us are in some kind of bubble. That's a dramatic example, but we're all going to encounter situations where we were certain about something prematurely, and we might then become more sophisticated about what we do with the information that we see, and how we select our sources.
Yeah. Can I ask you about the Republican moments,
Yes.
little r Republican moments? You argue that they're crucial and fundamental for moving forward with addressing the climate crisis, but is there evidence of any Republican moments in recent history? Do you have hope and optimism that there will be some going forward? And maybe I could also ask you about the choice of the word moments, which is really interesting in juxtaposition to the climate crisis, which is very much not just a moment, right? It is it is growing by the second.
Yeah, the term comes from a scholar named James Gray Pope. And it's really, I think the word moment is chosen from moments in Congress.
Okay.
So we've had two near Republican moments in Congress, near passage of the statutes anyway. Your question was, do I have hope for those or do I see them happening? I think like all of us, I'm pretty pessimistic about sort of 75% support in both chambers of Congress for strong climate legislation anytime soon. Part of the reason for that is that part of the ideological movement of the Republican Party since the 80s has been a turn against regulation as a tool, or mandates and prescriptive and proscriptive rules as a tool, so that we're able to do things that involve subsidies and support, like we did in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we might be able to do more of that. Some of you may know that 17 House Republicans signed a letter to the Speaker saying they don't want all of the IRA repealed. Some of it they really want to keep, and even though they all voted against it. And so, so we might have the chance to continue to do those kinds of things. I don't think that gets us to net zero, but it does a lot of good things. There's hope for other things that are happening outside of Congress, right? The market is driving a lot of investment in renewables. If we can get more transmission, even more will happen. And of course, some states are doing, tremendous things to push the ball forward. And perhaps the IRA will have the effects that its proponents, hope it will, and maybe will develop constituencies for continuing this transition in the right places, in those competitive districts where we can, have some legislative majorities for greenhouse gas regulation in the future. I don't think it's going to happen this Congress or the next one, but maybe it will have with everything else, will have the desired effect.
Yeah, yeah. I'll ask one more, and it is in consistent theme of kind of this more hopeful, optimistic questioning. And sorry for stealing everybody's question in the room, because I know you all want to ask this. Give us guidance, David. What you ended with really excellent suggestions as to how, but maybe setting aside our own kind of personal context in the way that we go about our daily lives and our consumption of social media and our engagement with our peers. What about in our professional roles? And I will ask two different professional roles. One is the students that are here. What do they do? What can they do in the classroom and beyond as they take on their future professions? And then for those of us in the room that are professors and are conducting research on energy policy, what can we do to contribute and push the ball forward?
So that's a great question, and I didn't really get at that much in my remarks. So most students will go to work for somebody, and that organization will have a point of view, and you'll be expected to represent that point of view. You can do so better if you have a full understanding of the issue and what the other side thinks, right? So I think everybody wants that deeper understanding of all the complexity and the hard part of the transition. And so if you're a lawyer, I teach law students, if you're a law student and you don't understand that, you're not going to do very well, right? And it's true of pretty much any job. You're going to want that deeper understanding, even if you're advocating a particular point of view. And there's nothing, I didn't mean to imply there's anything wrong with advocacy, but don't let advocacy deter you from acquiring that sort of fuller understanding. Very little in this field, I think, is morally unambiguous. I mean, I think the goal of getting to net zero is a laudable goal, and I share it, but there are hard aspects to it, right? And so if you can't get comfortable with ambiguity, it'll be harder to learn that. And so that's what I would say to students. And to faculty, I'm going to talk only for myself here because we had a really interesting conversation at dinner last night about this issue. I think experts should always put education before persuasion, personally. Just because I think when they don't do that, it undermines respect for expertise, it undermines faith in their message. And not every academic agrees with that. And that's fine. Reasonable people can disagree, but I really think it does damage to the cause. It's counterproductive when experts online are clearly lobbying for a particular outcome in ways that sand the inconvenient edges off the facts. I think they need to be complete and put that education function first. And that's just my point of view on that. So I would like to see all of us, both academics and writers, do our best to do that all the time. And, I've always taught that way where I try to make sure I bring in everything. I think most professors do. But it's easy in Texas where I'm running into people who are on all sides of the energy issue all the time. And so, if I don't, I know I'm leaving somebody out.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I'll go ahead and open the floor to questions. We have a mic that's coming around. We'll start with Parrish.
Thank you so much, David. Super interesting book and really clear articulation of the argument. So thank you. I wanted to ask you about deep canvassing. I was excited to hear you bring it up. Because studying deep canvassing in the context of climate policy has been like on my latent research agenda for a long time. If there's any students in the room who would be interested in being a research assistant for that, come find me. I am curious though, because most of Brockman and Kalla's work is in this context of exclusionary attitudes that people have, and in the context of LGBTQ rights, and immigrant and policies affecting immigrants. And I think that the mechanisms by which deep canvassing would work would be very different, partly because the cost trade-off is just really different. So like in the climate policy context, we're asking people potentially to take on some sort of short-term cost that's going to affect them very tangibly in order to achieve a long-term gain. This is like fundamental to the political economy of climate change, as we know. Not in every policy design, but it's hard to get around that. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to like what deep canvassing would actually look like in this context and what is the mechanism by which it would work. And so like thinking about the Brackman and Kalla case where they talk about perspective taking, and it's about saying like, when was the time that you felt excluded, and having people kind of connect their humanity, which I don't think it would be the same mechanism in the climate case. So
Yeah. So let me just say two things. So the other examples I use are Catherine Hayhoe's. I sort of digest her argument, which is specifically aimed at climate, and it's about finding a commonality, a common interest, or something in common with the person you're talking to, and tying the thing you're both interested in to climate, and having a conversation about it that's open-ended in the way I described over the period of your relationship. And the depolarization literature has some of that same sort of advice in it. But you're right that when it comes to citing an energy project, we're asking somebody to bear some costs, right? And I just saw in the news today a study out of the University of Pittsburgh where they asked people why farmers mainly, why do you oppose solar, right? So, but the thing about citing is that there's always going to be somebody who's not happy with the project, but there's also, if the project gets defeated, they must have also allies in the town or in whatever local jurisdiction we're talking about who probably aren't living next door to it, right? And so I have an example in the book of a hypothetical conversation with someone who opposes a wind farm because they're concerned about their friend who says that they don't want the wind farm near them. And there's a series of questions and sort of an iterated conversation that's entirely hypothetical, but it tries to give an example of how you would do that in that context. It probably won't change the friend's opposition, but it could potentially change the allies' opposition, right? And this is true of citing, and always has been true of citing. You're never going to have 100% consensus on it. And so I wouldn't purport to say that we could change everybody's point of view, but yeah. I mean, that in a way, that's the short version of that is the person that's bearing the cost loses out, right? I mean, and that's still true unless you have a compensation mechanism.
Unless you compensate them enough.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We'll go over here to Andy.
Yeah, Andy Humler from Penn Engineering. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your talk. Always gives me too much to think about. Sometimes too much to think about. But one of the themes you talked about today was that significant social legislation is not passed in Congress without a supermajority. It doesn't really pass with a slim majority. And you talked about this theme many years ago. And when I read that, I was kind of disheartened. I thought you might be lowering expectations going into the future Congresses. And all of a sudden, we have the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And those were passed without supermajorities. Those were passed with slim majorities. And when those laws came out, the thought that came to my mind was, how did this happen? What magic happened in the policymaking world that enabled those two things to get through Congress and happen? So could you talk just about that magic? How did that happen?
Yeah,
Thank you. Particularly
the Inflation Reduction Act just sort of came out of the blue, at least to those of us who were watching from the outside. So I believe, well, the bipartisan infrastructure bill was bipartisan, right? The Inflation Reduction Act was just Democrats, and it was outside of what they call regular order in Congress. Yeah, so you didn't need to get past the Senate filibuster. And that's a possibility every Congress. There's a few bills where that could happen, right? So we could have that again if Democrats have a majority and if we have a majority who will favor regulation, right? So I didn't, we might be able to get regulation without 75% support. I was noting that the durable regimes that exist today all had that kind of support, and as a way of sort of juxtaposing the situation we face today politically. But I'm hopeful that we can, I mean, it requires winning both houses, right? Unless Republicans change their attitude towards some of these issues, it requires winning both houses and a Democratic president. So when that happens, as during the Obama administration, we got the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, those laws have been nipped at and picked at and narrowed and weakened since then. So in the sense of that sort of durability issue is, still rearing its head in certain ways, but they weren't repealed, right? And so, so I didn't mean to imply that we can't make any progress, but yeah, I think that's a good point.
I hope my students in the room are getting their dopamine rushes by hearing themes that we just talked about this week. I love it. How about right here?
Thank you. Hi,
Hi.
I'm a freshman from Houston, and my question is that among a lot of Houstonians, especially young Houstonians, there's this sentiment that we, the voters, are powerless when it comes to climate change, that really it's up to corporations or developing countries abroad, that the impact we have as individuals doesn't really matter. But your research kind of seems to contradict that by saying that the bottom-up approach and how that impacts policy. So how do you think that we can reshape this narrative about we, the voters, individuals being powerless?
Yeah, this cynicism or this sense of powerlessness about the political process is, troubling to a lot of us as well, even those of us who aren't young. And I mean, you hear it all the time from Democratic politicians about sort of young people have to be involved. They have to talk, be participants in this process. And I think it's the young people who are most aware of how much they're being spun all the time, how much they're being lobbied all the time by online media. I'm hoping that a book like this will help people sort of think about being less cynical and feeling less hopeless about this. But it's true that this prescription involves millions of people doing this, right? I don't think there's an easy sort of silver bullet solution otherwise. Otherwise, I would recommend that. But the other benefit of this prescription, I think, is that, and I didn't talk about this, but I talk about it in chapter 6, I think it's necessary to preserve democratic norms in this country. I think you can't have a democracy where each side of the aisle continues to increasingly hate the other more intensely and still have rule of law and respect for truth and respect for fair political competition. We're already seeing those things break down. And so I quote Timothy Snyder, who many of you are probably familiar with from his New York Times op-eds and things. He's a historian of transitions to autocracy. And he sees the same things happening today here that happened in previous historical transitions to authoritarian governments. And I think this prescription is part of that. We have to be, sort of find a way to engage across ideological and partisan boundaries for that reason as well, not just because of climate policy.
Back row.
Thank you. I haven't read your book, but it occurred to me as I was listening to your remarks that you might have written this book about any number of other issues, and many of your remarks seemed to me that they would have been applicable for all those issues. Would you respond?
Yeah, I think that's a fair. I mean, certainly the description of how the model of how regulatory politics works that I use in the book, and the description of the propaganda machine. I didn't use that phrase today, but that's what chapter 4 is. And the material I talked about is about that sort of the effect of that propaganda is generalizable to lots of other issue areas. And I think that's fair. I was. In order to talk about the politics of the energy transition, I needed to have a model of how decisions are being made, and that model can certainly be applied elsewhere. So good observation.
Go right up here.
Thank you for your time, Professor. My question was maybe around the other two bodies that constitute the United States government, the executive and the judicial. So a lot of litigation has been happening around a lot of the climate policy as well, and it's been flowing back and forth quite a lot. And that causes a lot more problems as well in trying to figure out what you're going to be doing for the next couple of years. And then with that, when you add regulatory capture to a lot of the federal agencies and even state agencies, you have a lot more problems come about. And then how do people deal with that kind of environment? And that's been the environment since maybe 2007 onwards.
Even before that, in the environmental field anyway, even before that, the sort of whipsawing of policy back and forth, depending upon which party's in control of the White House. I mean, I would trace that back to the Bush administration reversing a lot of Clinton administration sort of environmental and also climate policies, or at least positions. And yeah, it's troubling for businesses, and it's troubling for anybody who cares about those policies. And I don't know, so I don't know that there's a solution to that unless we can persuade, at least the solution that I would want, unless we can persuade more Republican leaders to sort of take the climate issue more seriously. On the courts, the way I talk about that in the book, and it's not particularly insightful because everybody knows this, the courts have been kneecapping the regulators' power to exercise their discretion to address this issue. And so while the Biden administration is trying to enact rules or has enacted rules that are aiming to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, those rules are in danger because of recent Supreme Court decisions, not just the overturning of Chevron, but also the major questions doctrine decision, West Virginia versus EPA. I'm probably more skeptical than many of my peers about the ability of that rule to survive judicial review. So that's partly why I say congressional action is ultimately going to be necessary, and we ought to start working on making that happen now, even if it doesn't happen for 5 or 10 years.
Second to back.
Hi, I'm Andreas, and I run an energy development firm. And I wanted to ask about why bipartisanship has been hard, even when there should be consensus. And one example I have in mind is permitting reform, making it easy to build projects. You would think that the Democrats want renewable assets to be built, solar, wind, transmission lines, and should support that, and that the Republicans would want development and job-making profitable businesses to be able to build projects. But what we often see is the exact opposite, where the Democrats don't want projects to be built because they can hurt the environment. There might be like species that suffer from placing projects in certain places, and Republicans are just instinctively against renewables as a whole. So, and I'm picking that specific issue as an example where maybe despite the polarization, there's still room for consensus and bipartisanship on getting more projects built. So why has it been so hard to do that? Because it's really frustrating as a developer to run into these obstacles. And to some extent, it's true. It's much easier to build even renewable projects in the Midwest or Texas compared to California or the Northeast. But nonetheless, it does often feel like even something that should be bipartisan cannot be bipartisan today.
So I recently wrote a piece on the politics of that issue, which is embodied in the Manchin-Barrasso bill, which is a bill designed to speed up permitting of energy infrastructure of all types. I wrote a piece in the Regulatory Review, which is a University of Pennsylvania online outlet that you can find online. I think what's going on there is that it's a question of whether the pro sort of climate, pro energy transition people hate the speeding up of permitting fossil fuel projects more than they want the speeding up of the permitting of clean energy projects, and vice versa on the oil and gas side, right? So, but that's the theory of that bill, is that if we put those two things together, then we can get bipartisanship for reasons you just suggested in your question. And it remains to be seen whether that's going to be the case. It's still on the it's still in the hopper, or whatever the phrase is in Congress. I don't know, but I don't. It's still, I think it's been marked up by one committee, and there's other bills as well designed to speed up permitting, but nobody knows. The last I heard, which was last week, there are all kinds of other members of the Senate and House trying to insert other things into the bill. Whether those other things build a majority or make it impossible to build a majority remains to be seen. But there's a set of people on the environmental community is split on that bill. Some want it and some don't. And the ones that don't want it because they think it would build more fossil fuel infrastructure, which they see as locking in emissions into the future. So that's the answer to your question. I don't know if it's a satisfying answer for you or not. Yeah.
Yes, please. Coming around.
As a lawyer, how do you feel about the efforts to sue the fossil fuel industry, especially Exxon or whatever, and that could potentially be the way to change things, just like it did with the tobacco industry? They
Right.
finally got them.
That's a good question. This is another issue in which I might not be fully in step with most of my friends and colleagues. But I think it's a hard lift again for them. We don't know yet because those issues the oil companies have delayed those issues getting to the merits of the case by trying to move them into different courts and challenging jurisdiction and venue and things like that. So we don't really have much we have lots and lots of cases and very, very few that where courts have actually gotten to the merits in the United States. I think the analogy to tobacco companies is a little bit strained if you're talking about the company that pulled the asset or the fossil fuel out of the ground, as opposed to the company that burned it and emitted things, or sold the retail product that was burned and emitted things. But the analogy to the OxyContin litigation might be a better analogy for the plaintiffs in those cases where, but in any case, I think it's hard. There's a lot of intervening causes, right? After the asset is pulled from the ground. And some judges in dicta have said, I'm a little bit nervous about ascribing liability to the person who sold it to someone else who burned it, who then caused the emissions. And I'm a little bit nervous about ascribing or assigning liability to them if what they did also had a bunch of social benefits. And of course, the reliance on oil and gas and fossil fuel in the industrial age did have social benefits. Even though it's a wildly underpriced good because the social costs are not part of the price, there's still a tremendous amount of demand for it because the fossil fuels do things that people want done. So I don't know the answer. I mean, I think, that's how those turn out will be interesting, and even more interesting are the state superfund analogy. Have you heard about these laws, state climate superfund laws that Vermont passed and about 5 other states are considering, where they would statutorily assign liability through a state law to the fossil fuel companies based on, how much fuel they produced, in the past. So I dodged your question because I'm uncomfortable with the theory, but, not so uncomfortable that I would go out and protest if if the plaintiffs were victorious. Yeah. Right.
Case, Exxon's scientists who what the consequences are going to be.
And Shell's scientists as well, and probably a few others. There was active misinformation, and their models turned out to be among the best models predicting climate change. So there's this case in California now against the oil companies for misinformation associated with plastics, right? And that's sort of it's not a Lanham Act case, but it's about false advertising, right? And that's a more tight connection, a more tight cause of action than, you pulled oil from the ground in the 70s that somebody burned that got into the atmosphere and caused climate change. Those are a little bit different in my view, but I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I think judges will be put on the spot by those cases, and we'll see how they all react.
I'm unfortunately going to have to draw this conversation to a close.
Already?
Yeah, I have a few announcements, but first I would like to all take a moment to thank David.
Thank you.
That was excellent.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to hang around and talk to anybody that has a question that didn't get answered.
That's wonderful. That was going to be one of my announcements. I believe that David will not only stick around to answer additional questions, but also sign your books if you're interested and you have your book with you. I hope that I didn't just put you on the spot because I didn't confirm that ahead of time. A few other things. We recorded this and we will post it as of tomorrow on our website. We also have a phenomenal podcast at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy Now, led by Andy Stone, who's here in the audience. And the podcast is, I believe it'll be the next episode. Yep. 2 weeks from Tuesday. So keep your eye out for that, please. We have so many great events coming up. Climate Week is coming up. We have many speakers coming in even before then. But one event that I'd really like to pitch for you is our Carnot Prize. And our Carnot Prize, as some of you know, is the big prize that we give every year for somebody who is really making a phenomenal difference in the climate and energy policy space. And this year, we're very excited to give the prize to Jacqueline Patterson, who runs the Chisholm Legacy Project. She is an environmental justice advocate, and she's just a phenomenal human being. So please come out November 4th to celebrate with us for the Carnot Prize. And last, but not as important as the rest, there's lunch waiting outside for you. So please feel free to grab a lunchbox on your way out. And thank you all for coming today.